Peter Kuznick. Peter is the professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He also co-wrote with Oliver Stone The Untold History of the United States. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, Kim. Glad to be here.
So, Peter, start off with the story of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Why did Japan attack the U.S. naval base on the then U.S. colony on December 7th of 1941?
To understand the history, to put this in some context, you have to go back to at least 1931, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria. But the Japanese had their eyes on China. They saw Chinese resources. One context to put the Pacific War into is as a battle between competing imperialisms and competing colonialisms. So you've got the British colonies in Burma, Malaya, Hong Kong. You've got the American colonies in the Philippines and other American holdings in the Pacific. You've got the Dutch East Indies. You've got the French in Indochina. And the Japanese eyed those jealously and wanted to get a piece of the action themselves. In 1937, they began a full-scale war with China. Now, Japan is a resource-poor island, or a series of islands, and they were getting most of what they needed in terms of oil, metal, and other resources in trade with the United States. But their policy in China put them in direct confrontation with American interests, because the more the Japanese took in China, the more they cut off American and other Western economic access to the markets and the resources in China. The United States and its allies had imposed an open-door policy in China early in the 20th century. And you have to remember that going back to the 19th century, American businessmen always had this fantasy about the great China market that they were someday going to exploit. That fantasy still exists now. So they wanted the markets, they wanted the resources, but the Japanese were cutting it off. So the United States gradually responded to Japanese economic encroachment in China with tightening sanctions and embargoes against Japan. In August of 1940, Japan announces the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And in September of 1940, Japan joins with Germany and Italy to form the Axis. So at that point, then tensions are really rising. The United States ultimately gets to the point where it cuts off oil completely to Japan. Japan is very dependent upon that oil. Maybe something like 60 to 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. So now Japan has got to devise a different strategy. Also, in 1940, Japan had taken the French colonies in Indochina through an agreement with the Vichy government in France. So now they've got Indochina. They've announced the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The war in China is heating up. They join the Axis, but in order to get the oil that they need, their other alternative is the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia, as we now call it. So, now what stood between the Japanese and the Dutch East Indies? Pearl Harbor. So as long as the American fleet was intact at Pearl Harbor, and the American fleet had been moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor the previous year, had been headquartered in Pearl Harbor, so as long as the American fleet was there, it posed a threat to Japanese intentions of getting the oil and transporting the oil from the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia to Japan and to China. And so the Japanese strategy, stupid as it may be, was to launch the attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, thinking that a surprise attack of that sort could possibly sink and destroy the American fleet, if not knock the United States out of the war, set the United States back sufficiently that Japan would have a couple of years in which it could ride roughshod and seize the resources that it wanted in Southeast Asia, and defeat China, and get the oil it needed from the Dutch East Indies. That was the idea. It was a foolhardy idea, and it proved to be suicidal.